They called him Doc, but not out of respect. More like the way someone names a stray, half joke, half dismissal. Every morning, rain or shine, cold or burning hot, he sat on the rust-stained bench just outside the west entrance of the Fairfield Veterans Affairs Hospital. He never begged, never asked for anything, never even made eye contact unless someone spoke to him first. His coat was army green but patched with duct tape, his boots military issue but so worn the treads were almost smooth. Around his neck, hanging like a forgotten relic, were dog tags, polished every morning, it seemed, because they caught the light more than his eyes ever did. Most people didn't look at him. They looked through him. Interns shuffled past with clipboards, nurses in a rush to clock in, and patients, some in wheelchairs, others hobbling with canes, barely spared him a glance. He was part of the scenery, a fixture of the concrete, and the whispers weren't kind. He's probably a burnout, PTSD, or worse. I heard he used to talk to himself. Watch out. Why doesn't someone just move him along? But he wasn't in anyone's way. He just sat there, same bench, same position, same silent discipline, like he was guarding something invisible. And maybe he was. Now, before we dive deeper, let us know where you're watching from. And if you still believe that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off, if you believe dignity doesn't need permission, then hit like and subscribe, because what happens next proves one thing: honor never retires. The only person who really noticed him was a new intern named Lena Patel, third week on rotation, fresh out of nursing school with a heart too big for the job they were giving her. She wasn't supposed to talk to him. Someone had actually told her that, casually, like it was protocol. Just leave that guy be. He's harmless but stubborn. Probably confused. But Lena didn't believe in leaving people invisible. One morning, she walked out during her break with a coffee and a plain bagel wrapped in napkin. She offered it gently. "Sir," she said, unsure if he'd respond. He looked up slowly, his face worn like leather but his eyes alert, steady. "Thank you," he said, voice low but warm. "But I'm good." He nodded toward the sunrise. "Breakfast already on." She laughed before she could stop herself. "You always sit here?" "As long as they let me." He glanced at the badge around her neck. "Lena. First year." She blinked. "How'd you?" "I've seen a lot of rotations come through." He didn't smile, exactly, but something softened in his face. "You're one of the few who stop." After that, she greeted him every morning. Sometimes he'd answer. Sometimes he'd just nod. But he always had that little black notebook on his lap, writing in tight, angled script. "You journaling?" she asked once. "Just taking notes," he replied. "On what?" She smiled. "On the world." She thought about that for a long time. The staff, though, weren't as thoughtful. Security would sometimes hassle him when the director was on rounds. One guard in particular, Jason Callow, the guy who flexed his flashlight like it was a badge of honor, took to poking at him. "Still playing soldier." "Huh?" he once said while Doc sat quietly. "You even remember your rank, old man?" Doc didn't answer. He just stared forward like the insult hadn't touched him. "Guess not," Callow muttered, and walked off, victorious in a fight no one else was in. Later that day, Lena overheard a nurse joke in the break room. "I swear, that guy thinks he's some kind of war legend. Probably served fries at the PX." They all laughed. Except Lena. She thought about the way he had reached for his notebook with calloused hands, how the tags around his neck were always clean even when his coat wasn't. She thought about the way he looked at people, like he was scanning for something they didn't even realize was there. That's not the way someone looks unless they've been trained to. Then one day, everything shifted. The hospital's internal system crashed, a full outage. Patient records, medication charts, even access to some locked rooms were dead in the water. IT was scrambling, phones were ringing off the hook, and patients were starting to line up in confusion. Lena passed the front desk and saw Doc watching through the glass doors, notebook in hand. He stood, slowly, but with that same deliberate motion, and stepped inside. "Your backup node's looping into a ghost archive," he said calmly to the head nurse. "Reset the proxy array and pull from the mirror drive." She blinked. "What?" "Your system's not down," he explained. "It's trapped in a recursive load. Happens when the index gets corrupted. Manual reset will fix it. 10 minutes tops." "Do I look like an IT tech?" She snapped. But before she could finish mocking him, one of the actual techs who had just walked in overheard. He turned pale. "Wait, who told you that?" Doc shrugged. "I used to help design field trauma systems. Back when we didn't have time to wait on updates." Within minutes, the system was back online. The tech team looked at him like he'd stepped out of a classified file. Lena was stunned, but not surprised. "Doc," She asked him gently. What did you do before? He just tapped his notebook. Watched. Learned. Tried to help when I could. She stared at the name etched into his tags. Mush, Samuel Irons. And beneath it, a number. One that didn't show up in any hospital system, but when she called a friend in veterans' records to check it, the line went quiet for a long moment. Then came the whisper, you're standing next to a legend. But the VA never noticed. Not yet. Not until the name on the bench became the name on every screen in the country. And when they finally looked him up, they'd realize what they'd walked past every day without ever knowing. A battlefield surgeon, a whistleblower, a man whose silence had saved lives. And a legacy too heavy for a bench to carry much longer. The next morning, the bench was empty. Lena noticed it before she even made it through the front doors. No green coat. No boots planted squarely beneath the concrete. No flash of dog tags catching the sun. Just a vacant stretch of metal and rust, chilled by the frost that clung to its edges. For a moment, she thought maybe he'd finally left. Maybe the daily ridicule, the silent judgment, or just the cold had finally driven him away. But something about that thought didn't sit right. Not with what she knew now. Not with what she'd read the night before. Because after the system rebooted and Doc casually walked away, like saving a federal server, was just another Tuesday morning, Lena went digging. Really digging. She ran his name again. Major Samuel T. Irons, Army Medical Corps. Honorable discharge. 27 years of active service. 3 tours. 2 combat zones. 1 unfiled Medal of Honor recommendation buried so deep even the Military Records Office hadn't confirmed its status in years. But it was real. Signed by a general whose name still made headlines. And more than that, there was a report. A scathing, classified document penned in his own hand, blowing the whistle on a private contractor that had supplied faulty trauma gear to field units, resulting in the deaths of over 24 soldiers. Doc had reported it, then vanished. Discharged quietly. Pension revoked. No ceremony. No closure. Just silence. They didn't court-martial him. They erased him. And he let them. Probably thought that was the price of doing what was right. Lena couldn't sleep after reading it. She stayed up rereading every page, every redacted line. And when the sun came up, she rushed in early, only to find his spot empty. But Doc wasn't gone. He was inside, barely. Sitting alone on a hallway bench near the emergency wing, notebook in hand, face paler than usual, a tremor in his fingers that hadn't been there the day before. She ran to him. Are you all right? He looked up, slowly, with the same calm she'd come to expect. Caught a chill, he said simply. Old bones aren't what they were. But his breathing was labored. Have you been checked out? She asked. They won't see me, he murmured, like he was telling her the weather forecast. No insurance. No record in the system. Already tried. That last part stung. Lena stared at him. This man who had literally rebooted their failing infrastructure with a single sentence. This man who'd once commanded mobile triad units under live fire. Who'd been the last face dozens of dying soldiers had ever seen. And now he couldn't even get a blood test. She didn't ask permission. She wheeled over a vitals cart, checked his pulse, temperature, BP. It wasn't good. Low-grade fever, shallow breaths. Probably pneumonia. She reported it. Filed it under emergency protocol. Her supervisor pushed back, tried to wave it off. He's not a patient of record, they said. Not until we process him. And how long will that take? She snapped. A day? 2. They shrugged. That's not my department. But by then, she'd already pulled his name into the intake system. Not because he had coverage, he didn't, but because she'd put him under her emergency authorization code. A risk, she knew, but one she was willing to take. She stayed with him during the scan. When the doctor came back with the results, they were grim. Early-stage pneumonia, aggravated by prolonged exposure and prior untreated lung trauma. Old shrapnel scarring, consistent with blast impact. They wanted to send him to a shelter with antibiotics. He's stable, they said. Not critical. But Lena knew that was bureaucratic speak for, not our problem. She called a friend at the local paper. Told them a decorated veteran, whose expertise had saved the VA system just 24 hours earlier, was being quietly discharged into the cold. The friend hesitated, then agreed. They asked for proof. Lena sent the scan of the dog tags. The name. The photo of his weathered notebook filled with notes on the VA system's blind spots and vulnerabilities. Within 2 hours, the story was online. And then it exploded. Twitter picked it up first. then Facebook. Then a veteran-led podcast read the article live and played a 2010 audio clip from a declassified military panel where a man, voice calm, precise, spoke about integrity under fire. It was him, no doubt. By noon, the VA's switchboard was overloaded. By 3 p.m., someone from Washington had called. The story had reached Senator Albright's office, who personally requested a briefing. They wanted to know why a former major was sleeping on a bench while the system he once helped build labeled him a non-priority. And still, Doc said nothing. He remained in his room, resting quietly, eyes closed, dog tags tucked under his shirt like always. When Lena told him what was happening, he didn't react. Just nodded slowly. Didn't do it for them, he whispered. Didn't do it for thanks. Why did you, she asked. He looked at her then, eyes soft. Because when the system fails, someone's got to remember how to patch it. The next morning, he was moved to a private room. A real one. Clean linens, proper care, even a service flag mounted quietly in the corner. Lena returned to his bench outside the VA, where something new had been left behind. A bouquet of dogwood flowers, a folded note tucked between the stems. She opened it. He watched us when we didn't know we needed watching. Now it's our turn. Signed by a group of current and former medics who had served under him in Kabul. Word had gotten out, and while the brass hadn't shown up yet, the silence had shifted. Nurses started asking questions. One even apologized, not out of guilt, but out of awareness. And still, Doc said little. But his presence now carried weight, reverence. And Lena realized something profound. This wasn't vindication. It was restoration. Quiet, dignified, and long overdue. She returned to his room that evening, just before lights out. They're saying they want to name something after you, she said gently. A new protocol, based on your notes. He didn't smile, but he did say something she'd never forget. Don't give it my name, he murmured. Give it to the ones who died before I could write their stories down. And then he closed his eyes, resting, finally, not like a man who had been ignored, but like one who had made peace with being remembered the right way. They didn't hold a ceremony for document. He would have hated that, no medals, no speeches, no spotlight. But that didn't mean people forgot. The bench where he once sat every morning outside the VA was replaced with a new one, welded in bronze, engraved with just 13 words. M.A.J. Samuel T. Irons, service endures, even when systems forget. No fanfare. Just reverence. Staff began stopping there in the mornings, some to sit, others just to place a hand on the cool metal, like they were tapping in for a shift he never abandoned. Lena sat every Wednesday for 13 minutes, and though no one said why, eventually others joined. They didn't need to ask. They knew. Inside, the hospital launched a pilot program based on his notes, Ironside. They called it, designed to flag silent cases like his before they were forgotten. No more pushing away the people who didn't fit the file. No more red tape before basic care. Just observation. Pattern recognition. Empathy. The system started seeing what Doc had seen all along. But by the time it rolled out, he was gone. He left without warning, no discharge, no explanation. A nurse said she saw him get into a black sedan one morning just before sunrise, wearing that same patched coat, notebook under his arm. His room was spotless. Bed made. A cup of cold coffee on the tray. And on the nightstand, a folded copy of a 2009 VA incident report, the one that buried his whistleblower complaint. One line was underlined and read, initial complaints dismissed. He hadn't disappeared. He had simply moved on. Again. And still, the impact remained. A week later, Lena got a package. No return address. Inside was his notebook, his original one. Worn, soft at the edges, full of scribbles and sharp observations. The final page, once blank, now held only 6 words. Now that you see them, stay. She read it 3 times. Then she cried, not because he was gone, but because she finally understood. He hadn't wanted to be seen. He wanted others to be. That was the legacy. So she returned to the bench that day, tapped the plaque gently, and whispered, still watching. Then she walked through those hospital doors not just as a nurse, but as the one now standing post. Because somewhere out there, Doc still was. Quiet. Unseen. And making sure the system stayed honest, even if no one ever knew he was there.